The lamp flickers. In the silence before dawn, Marcus Lucilius crushes another handful of berries, their juice pooling dark as wine in the ceramic bowl. The smell is sweet, deceptive. To anyone watching, and someone is always watching, he appears to be preparing dye for fabric. But the slave who passes his window sees only an old merchant at work. She cannot see what Marcus sees, the words that will appear on blank papyrus when this liquid dries to invisibility. This is not his real work. Marcus Lucilius does not exist, not truly. The name is a convenience, a mask worn for the emperor's business. His real name died the day he took the oath, swearing to serve Rome in the shadows where empires truly rise and fall. Tonight, he composes a message that will never be read by Roman eyes. It is meant for another shadow walker, someone embedded deep in Parthian territory, where Rome's greatest enemy plots in darkness. But what makes a liquid invisible? How do you hide words in plain sight? The answer lies in chemistry that ancient peoples understood through practice rather than theory. Certain substances, the juice of lemons, the milk of certain plants, solutions of alum, even simple urine, dry to near invisibility on papyrus or parchment. Heat or specific chemicals reveal what was hidden. The Spartans knew this centuries before Rome existed. The Persians perfected it. The Chinese discovered different methods entirely, using rice water and charcoal mixtures. Tonight, we journey into the hidden history of espionage, into the world of invisible ink and coded messages, of double agents and assassination plots. We will walk through the courts of emperors and the tents of generals, stand in the laboratories of ancient alchemists and the scriptoriums of forgers. We will meet the spies who changed history, and the ones history forgot. This is the story of how empires kept their secrets. Rome, in the year 122 of the Common Era, stretches across her 7 hills like a lion at rest. Powerful, dangerous, deceptively calm. Nearly 1 million souls crowd into this city of marble and mud, of emperors and slaves, of secret police and silent knives. The Emperor Hadrian rules from the Palatine Hill, but his true power reaches far beyond what his legions can hold. It extends through networks of informers, through coded diplomatic letters, through agents who speak the languages of Rome's enemies better than their own Latin. But Rome did not invent espionage. She merely perfected it, systematized it, made it an instrument of state policy. The roots of spycraft reach back thousands of years before Rome's founding. Back to the moment when one tribe first sent a young man to live among enemies and report their weaknesses. Back to when kings first realized that knowledge could be more valuable than swords. The ancient Egyptians employed spies as early as 3,000 years before the Common Era. Pharaoh's agents infiltrated Nubian kingdoms to the south, Libyan tribes to the west. They learned languages, adopted foreign dress, lived for years among potential enemies. When Egypt went to war, Pharaoh's generals knew exactly where to strike. The Egyptians pioneered methods we still recognize today. They created the first courier systems with sealed messages, the first diplomatic codes where certain words meant different things to initiated readers. A letter about grain shipments might actually discuss troop movements. A complaint about trade might signal an assassination planned. The Hittites, ruling their empire from Anatolia, employed sophisticated intelligence networks. Their archives, preserved in clay tablets, reveal systematic espionage operations. They sent merchants into enemy territories who were actually trained observers. These merchant spies noted the condition of roads, the strength of fortifications, the mood of populations. They counted wagons and estimated harvests, calculating whether an enemy could sustain a long siege. But the true masters of ancient espionage emerged in Persia. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, stretching from India to Egypt at its height, could not be governed by force alone. The Emperor Darius I, ruling around 500 years before the Common Era, created the king's eyes and king's ears, networks of inspectors and spies who traveled throughout the empire. They appeared without warning, checking on satraps and generals, ensuring loyalty, sniffing out plots before they ripened into rebellion. These agents carried the authority of the king himself. A corrupt governor might wake to find a king's eye sitting in his reception hall, holding sealed orders. The eye had unlimited access to records, could question anyone, had the power to order executions on the spot. Fear of these inspectors kept the empire functioning despite its vast size. The Persians also perfected the art of the coded message. Their diplomats and spies used substitution ciphers, replacing letters with symbols or numbers, making correspondence unintelligible to anyone who intercepted it. They embedded secret messages in seemingly innocent letters by marking certain words or letters, creating a hidden text within the visible one. And they pioneered an even more brutal method of secret communication. Hesiodorus, a Greek historian writing centuries later, describes how the Persian satrap Hestiaeus sent a message to his ally Aristagoras. Hestiaeus shaved the head of his most trusted slave, tattooed a message on his scalp, then waited for the hair to grow back. The slave traveled to Aristagoras carrying what appeared to be an ordinary verbal message. Upon arrival, Aristagoras shaved the slave's head, revealing the true communication: instructions to begin a revolt against Persian rule. The slave's body became the message. His humanity was erased in service of secrecy. This willingness to use human beings as tools, as expendable resources in the games of power, characterizes much of ancient espionage. Spies were rarely heroes. They were instruments, often discarded after use, their sacrifices unrecorded, their names forgotten. In China, a different philosophy of espionage emerged, one shaped by the teachings of military theorist Sun Tzu. Writing around 500 years before the Common Era, Sun Tzu composed The Art of War, a text that would influence military thinking for millennia. An entire chapter addresses spies with systematic precision. Sun Tzu categorized 5 types of spies: local spies recruited from among the enemy's own people, inside spies from among enemy officials, double agents who pretend to work for the enemy while actually serving you, expendable spies who are fed false information and allowed to be captured, spreading deception, and surviving spies who return with intelligence. This systematic approach transformed espionage from an ad hoc practice into a science. Sun Tzu advocated treating spies well, paying them generously, protecting their identities fiercely. He understood that intelligence work requires trust, that a spy who feels valued will risk more, endure more, deliver better information. Chinese emperors implemented Sun Tzu's principles throughout the imperial administration. The secret police, forerunners of organizations that would terrorize Chinese populations for centuries, emerged during the Qin dynasty in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the same ruler who built the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army, also created networks of informers who reported on anyone speaking against imperial policies. Criticism of the emperor became a death sentence, not just for the speaker, but for their entire family. This created a climate of fear, where neighbors informed on neighbors, where children reported their parents' private conversations. The empire became a prison where everyone watched everyone else, and the emperor's agents watched them all. The methods of surveillance were sophisticated. Agents disguised as merchants, as beggars, as minor officials, circulated through markets and tea houses, listening to conversations. They noted who met with whom, who seemed to have money they shouldn't have, whose circumstances changed suddenly. Any anomaly could indicate disloyalty or corruption. But all these empires, Egypt, Persia, China, were eventually surpassed by one particular innovation in the craft of invisible communication: the citale. Sparta, that most militaristic of Greek city-states, developed the citale around the 5th century before the Common Era. The device seems simple: a wooden rod of specific diameter, around which a narrow strip of leather or parchment is wound tightly. The sender writes their message along the length of the rod across the wrapped strip. When unwound, the strip shows only random letters, meaningless to anyone who intercepts it. But wound around another rod of identical diameter, the letters align, revealing the message. This was encryption through physical means, security through geometry. A Spartan general in the field would receive what appeared to be a belt or strap, decorated with random letters. Only when wound around his citale, issued to him before deployment, would the battle orders or strategic intelligence become clear. The citale represented a crucial insight: that messages could be hidden not through chemistry but through arrangement, through the clever application of physical principles. This understanding would eventually lead to more sophisticated ciphers, to the complex mathematical encryptions we use today. But the Greeks contributed more than devices. They contributed the concept of the agent provocateur, the operative who doesn't merely observe but acts to create situations that serve their employer's interests. Athens and Sparta, locked in the devastating Peloponnesian War, deployed agents into each other's territories and into neutral cities. These weren't just observers, they were influencers, propagandists, saboteurs. An Athenian agent in a neutral city might spread rumors about Spartan atrocities, might pay certain citizens to speak against Sparta in the assembly, might arrange for grain shipments to fail so that the city grew desperate and turned to Athens for help. The historian Thucydides, himself a general in the war, describes these operations with clinical detail. He understood that battles were often won before armies met, won in the secret councils where decisions got made, in the minds of people swayed by carefully planted fears or hopes. One particularly clever operation involved the city of Mytilene. When this city rebelled against Athenian control, Athens sent an army to crush the revolt and execute all adult males. The assembly had voted for this extreme punishment, but overnight, opinion shifted. Different speakers rose to argue for mercy, for moderation. The assembly reversed itself, sending a second ship to countermand the death sentence. Was this genuine change of heart? Or had Athenian agents working for a faction that opposed wholesale slaughter spent the night visiting key assembly members, making arguments, offering incentives? Thucydides leaves the question open, but he makes clear that such persuasion campaigns were common, that politics and espionage were inseparable. The Greeks also developed sophisticated techniques for hiding messages within messages. Steganography, hiding the existence of a message rather than encoding it, reached new levels of creativity. One method involved writing a letter on a wooden tablet, then coating it with wax and writing an innocent message on the wax surface. The recipient would scrape away the wax to reveal the hidden text underneath. Another method proved even more imaginative: invisible tattoos. A messenger would be tattooed with a message using a special ink made from milk and certain plant extracts. The tattoo remained invisible under normal circumstances. But when the recipient applied a specific mixture, perhaps a combination of ashes and vinegar, the tattoo would darken, becoming readable. After reading, it could be made invisible again. The messenger might travel for weeks, completely unaware of the message literally written on their skin, unable to betray what they didn't know they carried. These techniques required substantial knowledge of chemistry and materials. Someone had to discover that certain plant milks remained invisible until treated with specific substances. Someone had to experiment, probably repeatedly, probably on their own skin, to perfect the formulas. This hidden history of ancient chemists working in service of espionage remains largely unrecorded, but their innovations shaped how empires communicated in secret. By the time Alexander the Great began his conquest of the known world in 336 BCE, espionage had become an essential tool of empire building. Alexander's advanced scouts were more than military observers. They were intelligence operatives who spent months ahead of the army, learning languages, studying local politics, identifying potential allies and traitors. When Alexander approached a city, he often knew more about its internal divisions than its own rulers did. He knew which nobles nursed grievances, which merchants wanted access to broader markets, which priests could be persuaded that Alexander's conquest represented divine will. By the time his army arrived, the conquest was often half complete, achieved through information and persuasion rather than swords. Alexander also faced espionage directed against him. The Persian Emperor Darius, fighting to preserve his realm, employed numerous agents to assassinate the young Macedonian king. Some posed as deserters from Alexander's army. Others infiltrated his camp as slaves or entertainers. All failed, but not for lack of trying. One assassination attempt nearly succeeded. A trusted physician offered to cure Alexander of a fever. A note arrived warning that this physician had been bribed by Darius to poison the king. Alexander read the note, then drank the medicine while handing the note to the physician. It was a test of nerve and trust. If the physician showed guilt, Alexander would know the warning was true. The physician read the note and showed only outrage. The medicine was genuine. Alexander recovered. The physician remained loyal. But the attempt illustrates how espionage and counter-espionage became personal for rulers. Every servant might be a spy. Every healer might be an assassin. The isolation this created, the paranoia it fostered, shaped how emperors ruled and often how they died. After Alexander's death, his empire fragmented into successor kingdoms that warred against each other for generations. These Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria and Persia, the Antigonids in Macedonia, maintained elaborate spy networks against each other. Each court was infiltrated by agents of rival courts. The Ptolemaic court in Alexandria became particularly notorious for its intrigue. The famous Library of Alexandria, often celebrated as a center of learning, also served intelligence functions. Scholars who came from across the known world to study were quietly interviewed by royal agents. What was the political situation in their home cities? What technologies were being developed elsewhere? What strategic materials were becoming scarce or abundant? Information gathered in the library's reading rooms might inform trade negotiations or military planning. Knowledge was power, and Alexandria collected it systematically, cataloging not just books but the intelligence value of their contents. The Seleucid Empire, sprawling across the former Persian heartland, inherited Persian intelligence methods. They maintained the system of royal inspectors, though now called by different names. These agents moved through the vast empire on the excellent roads that Persian kings had built centuries earlier, roads now serving Greek masters. Into this world of Hellenistic intrigue and Persian subterfuge, a new power was rising in the West. Rome having conquered Italy, now looked eastward with ambitious eyes. And Rome brought to espionage the same qualities that characterized all Roman endeavors: systematic organization, brutal efficiency, and an utter lack of sentimentality. The Romans called their intelligence operatives speculatores, literally observers or scouts. But these were far more than scouts. They were the emperor's shadows, his invisible hands reaching into every corner of the empire and beyond. During the Punic Wars against Carthage, Rome deployed speculatores throughout the Mediterranean. These agents posed as merchants, as sailors, as slaves. They mapped Carthaginian supply lines, identified the sources of Carthage's mercenary armies, located the mines that provided silver for Carthaginian war-making. When the Roman general Scipio Africanus invaded North Africa to strike directly at Carthage, he knew exactly where to land, exactly which Numidian tribes could be turned against Carthage, exactly which routes were least defended. This knowledge didn't come from luck. It came from years of patient intelligence work by unnamed operatives who risked and often lost their lives to gather it. The Romans also pioneered the use of what we might call psychological operations. Before attacking a city, Roman agents would spread carefully crafted rumors that Roman armies never lost, that resistance meant total annihilation, that cooperation brought prosperity and citizenship. Fear and hope were weapons as effective as siege engines. But Rome's espionage capabilities truly matured under the empire, particularly under Augustus Caesar. The man who transformed Rome from republic to empire understood that autocratic rule required comprehensive surveillance. Augustus created the frumentarii, originally grain officials responsible for the army's food supply. But under imperial rule, these officials became much more. Traveling throughout the empire on legitimate business, they also observed political sentiment, reported on the loyalty of governors and generals, and carried secret correspondence for the emperor. A frumentarius arriving in a provincial city to inspect grain stores might also be there to verify whether the governor was plotting rebellion, whether local merchants were evading taxes, whether the garrison showed signs of discontent. The grain inspection was the cover. Intelligence gathering was the true mission. Augustus also employed the delatores, informers who reported crimes against the state, particularly treason. But treason was defined broadly enough to include almost any criticism of the emperor. The delator system encouraged citizens to spy on each other, creating a climate of suspicion that helped preserve imperial power but poisoned social trust. A successful delator received a portion of the condemned person's confiscated property. This created terrible incentives. People fabricated accusations for profit. Innocent remarks, taken out of context, became evidence of treason. The system corrupted both the accusers, who became professional informers, and the accused, who learned never to speak freely. The Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's successor, took this system to paranoid extremes. He relied heavily on his prefect Sejanus, who ran what amounted to a secret police force. Sejanus's agents infiltrated every level of Roman society. Senators knew their slaves might be reporting to Sejanus. Slaves knew their fellow slaves might be agents. No one could be certain who was listening. This pervasive surveillance shaped how people communicated. They developed elaborate codes and euphemisms. Dangerous topics were discussed only in open spaces, where conversations couldn't be overheard easily, or in bathhouses where the noise of water and many voices provided acoustic cover. The rich irony is that Sejanus himself was eventually accused of treason. His network of informers couldn't protect him from imperial suspicion. He was arrested and executed, his body torn apart by Roman mobs. His children were killed. His name was erased from monuments. The spy master became the victim of the very system he had perfected. But the system survived. Each emperor refined it, adapted it to their particular paranoia or ambition. Under Nero, the surveillance focused on identifying potential rivals and critics of the emperor's artistic pretensions. Under Domitian, who truly earned his reputation for tyranny, the spy networks reached peak effectiveness and peak cruelty. Domitian employed agents throughout the provinces, in the Senate, in the army, even within his own palace. He trusted no one, and this lack of trust became self-fulfilling. His constant surveillance and sudden executions created genuine conspiracies where none had existed before. Eventually, a group, including his own wife, arranged his assassination. The informers who surrounded him either didn't know about the plot or chose not to report it. The emperor's death illustrated a crucial limitation of surveillance states. When everyone fears everyone else, when trust evaporates completely, the system becomes brittle. It can shatter suddenly, brought down by the very fear it creates. But surveillance was only one aspect of Roman espionage. The empire also conducted active intelligence operations far beyond its borders. Roman agents operated deep in Parthian territory, Rome's great rival to the east. These operatives lived for years as merchants or scholars, learning Parthian languages and customs, converting to Persian religions, marrying local women. Their cover had to be perfect because discovery meant torture and death. These deep cover agents sent intelligence back to Rome through elaborate systems. A message hidden in a shipment of silk, a report concealed in the hollow handle of a merchant's measuring staff. Information passed verbally through a chain of intermediaries, each knowing only their immediate contact, so that if one link was compromised, the chain wasn't broken. The intelligence they provided shaped Roman military strategy. When the Emperor Trajan invaded Parthia in 114 of the Common Era, he knew which Parthian nobles were discontented, which cities would resist and which might surrender where the treasury was kept, how many soldiers the Parthian emperor could muster. This wasn't luck. It was the fruit of decades of patient intelligence work. The Romans also intercepted and decoded enemy communications. When they captured Parthian messengers, scribes trained in Parthian languages would attempt to decipher any coded sections. The Romans understood substitution ciphers and frequency analysis, the technique of guessing at encrypted letters based on how often different letters appear in normal text. A skilled cryptanalyst, though they wouldn't have used that term, could break simple substitution ciphers given enough time and text. They looked for patterns, for repeated sequences that might represent common words. They made educated guesses based on context. It was painstaking work requiring patience and linguistic skill, but it yielded results. The Romans weren't alone in these endeavors. The Parthians conducted similar operations against Rome. They had agents in Roman eastern provinces, in Alexandria, possibly even in Rome itself. When Parthian armies invaded Roman territory, they also knew which local populations resented Roman rule, where supplies could be obtained, which routes were lightly defended. This invisible war of intelligence and counterintelligence shaped the visible wars between armies. Battles were often won before they were fought, won by the side with better information. But not all espionage served military purposes. Economic intelligence was equally valuable. Roman agents monitored trade routes, investigating where silk really came from, how pepper was grown, where the best pearls were harvested. This information helped Roman merchants negotiate better prices and helped the state decide where to focus diplomatic or military efforts to secure access to luxury goods. The famous Silk Road connecting Rome to China was as much an intelligence corridor as a trade route. Every merchant traveling its length carried not just goods, but information. Sharp-eyed observers noted which kingdoms seemed prosperous, which seemed weak, where bandits operated, where new opportunities emerged. Roman and Chinese sources both mention embassies and travelers reaching the other empire, though the journeys were rare and difficult. Did these embassies include intelligence operatives? Almost certainly. A diplomatic mission provided perfect cover for gathering strategic information about a distant civilization. What did a Roman agent in China observe? The extent of Chinese military power, the sophistication of Chinese bureaucracy, the sources of silk production, though the Chinese guarded this secret carefully, the nature of Chinese inventions like paper and porcelain, any information that might give Rome strategic or economic advantage. Similarly, Chinese envoys to Rome noted Roman military organization, mining techniques, glassmaking methods. They observed political structures, trying to understand how a republic had become an empire, how succession worked when emperors didn't come from hereditary dynasties. This mutual observation shaped how empires understood each other, even when separated by thousands of miles and several intermediary kingdoms. But perhaps the most sophisticated and morally complex aspect of ancient espionage was the practice of human intelligence, recruiting locals to betray their own people. How do you convince someone to become a traitor? The ancient texts provide glimpses of the methods used. Money was the simplest inducement. A Roman agent might offer a Parthian official gold, far more gold than the official earned in years of service. For some, the offer was irresistible, but money alone rarely created reliable spies. Better to find someone with a grievance, someone passed over for promotion, someone whose family had been dishonored. These personal motivations created stronger loyalty than gold. Ideology could also motivate. A local who believed Roman rule would bring better governance, more justice, greater prosperity, might genuinely want to help Rome conquer their homeland. From our modern perspective, we might call them collaborators or traitors. They might have seen themselves as patriots bringing civilization to their people. Blackmail worked too. If an agent discovered someone's secret, a hidden crime, a forbidden love, embezzlement, they could leverage this knowledge to force cooperation. The victim of blackmail made an unreliable spy, prone to desperation and confession. But sometimes desperation made people useful in the short term. The best agents were those recruited young, before firm loyalties developed. A Roman operative might identify a promising youth in a client kingdom, sponsor their education, bring them to Rome for training, then send them back to serve their native ruler, while secretly reporting to Rome. This person might spend their entire career as a double agent, rising to positions of influence, shaping policies to favor Rome, while appearing to serve their homeland faithfully. These double agents faced extraordinary psychological strain. They lived constant lies, maintaining two identities, never certain who they could trust. Their work might prevent wars, saving thousands of lives. Or it might enable conquests that destroyed entire cultures. The moral weight must have been crushing. Ancient sources rarely give us the perspective of the spies themselves. We have reports from spy masters, from emperors who employed spies, from generals who used intelligence. But the actual operatives, the people who lived in shadows and died quietly when discovered, left few records. Their voices are mostly silent in history. When we do hear them, it's usually through trial records or confessions extracted under torture. These sources are unreliable. Torture produces false confessions, and trials are staged to justify predetermined verdicts. But occasionally a detail rings true, suggesting genuine human experience. One fragmentary account describes a Greek spy captured by Parthians. Under interrogation, he explained his motivation simply: "I have 5 children and no land." This brief statement contains multitudes: economic desperation, a father's fear for his children's future, the impossible choice between loyalty to one's people and loyalty to one's family. Did this admission save him? The text breaks off, the spy's fate unknown. But his words survived, preserved perhaps because they represented something universal that transcended the specific politics of Rome and Parthia. They reminded readers that spies were human beings, making terrible choices in impossible situations. The Romans showed little mercy to captured spies. Execution was standard, often preceded by torture to extract information about spy networks and methods. The torture served intelligence purposes, but it also sent messages. Captured spies were sometimes executed publicly to warn others, to demonstrate the cost of betrayal. Yet Rome continued to find willing spies. The incentives remained powerful. The gold was real. The promises of protection and new identity were sometimes honored, and some people genuinely believed in Rome's civilizing mission, believed that Roman conquest brought law, peace, and prosperity to chaotic regions. This belief wasn't entirely false. Roman rule did bring infrastructure: roads, aqueducts, baths. It brought a common currency and language that facilitated trade. It brought Roman law, which, however harsh, was more consistent than the arbitrary justice of local tyrants. Some conquered peoples genuinely prospered under Roman administration. But this came at a terrible cost: loss of independence, cultural absorption, enslavement of war prisoners, crushing taxation. Whether the trade-off was worthwhile depended on perspective. A wealthy merchant might thrive under Roman rule. A displaced farmer whose land had been confiscated for a veterans' colony might see things differently. Spies who betrayed their people to Rome navigated these moral complexities. Some reconciled themselves by believing they served a greater good. Some lived with guilt and rationalization. Some stopped thinking about it, focusing on survival and reward. Meanwhile, in the Far East, Chinese empires developed their own sophisticated espionage capabilities, distinct in some ways from Western methods, but equally effective. The Han Dynasty, ruling China during roughly the same period as Rome's empire, maintained extensive intelligence networks both within China and in surrounding territories. The Chinese approach to espionage reflected Confucian bureaucratic philosophy: systematic, hierarchical, carefully recorded. Chinese spies were often drawn from the scholar official class, educated men who could read and write, who understood statecraft and could analyze strategic situations. They might be sent as diplomatic envoys to neighboring kingdoms, but their true mission was intelligence gathering. They would observe military strength, note economic conditions, identify potential allies or weaknesses that Chinese armies might exploit. The Chinese also employed non-Chinese operatives, recruiting from the many different ethnic groups along China's borders. A spy from a Xiongnu tribe could move freely in Xiongnu territory, gathering information on these frequent enemies of Han China. A Sogdian merchant could travel the Silk Road, noting political changes in Central Asian kingdoms that might affect Chinese interests. Chinese record-keeping provides us with more details about specific intelligence operations than we get from Western sources. Chinese historians viewed espionage as a legitimate aspect of statecraft worth documenting, whereas Roman sources are often more circumspect, treating intelligence work as something distasteful even if necessary. One documented operation involved Ban Chao, a Han general serving in Central Asia in the late 1st century of the Common Era. Ban Chao commanded small forces far from Chinese territory, maintaining Chinese influence through a combination of diplomacy, military skill, and intelligence work. When the Xiongnu sent envoys to the kingdom of Shanshan, attempting to turn this Chinese ally against Han interests, Ban Chao had to act quickly with limited resources. He couldn't attack openly. He commanded only 36 men. Instead, he gathered intelligence on the Xiongnu envoys' location and habits. He learned they felt secure, protected by Shanshan's hospitality. Ban Chao led his men in a night attack on the envoys' compound. They set fires and killed the Xiongnu envoys before Shanshan's king could respond. The next morning, Ban Chao presented the king with the severed heads of the envoys. The message was clear. Chinese power reached even here, far beyond China's borders. Shanshan remained loyal to Han interests. This operation combined intelligence gathering with decisive action. Ban Chao's success depended on knowing exactly where the envoys stayed, how many guards they had, when they would be vulnerable. This knowledge came from his network of informers in Shanshan, perhaps servants in the compound, perhaps merchants who traded with both Chinese and Xiongnu. Chinese intelligence operations also focused heavily on internal security. The Han dynasty faced numerous rebellions and conspiracies. Local officials reported suspicious activities to higher authorities. The court maintained networks of informers watching for signs of sedition among the nobility and scholar class. But the Chinese approach differed from Roman methods in important ways. Chinese culture placed enormous emphasis on loyalty, especially filial piety and loyalty to one's ruler. Confucian education reinforced these values. This made recruiting Chinese officials as spies extraordinarily difficult. The cultural taboo against betrayal was stronger than in the West. Conversely, when Chinese people did become spies against their own government, they often rationalized their betrayal in Confucian terms. They weren't being disloyal, they were serving a higher loyalty. Perhaps the current emperor had lost the mandate of heaven through unjust rule. Perhaps a rebellion leader represented legitimate authority. These mental gymnastics allowed people to reconcile betrayal with deeply held values. Chinese cryptography developed somewhat differently from Western methods. While Western codes relied heavily on letter substitution, Chinese writing systems made this approach less practical. Instead, Chinese cryptographers often used book codes, where numbers referred to specific characters in a known text. Only someone possessing the same edition of the same book could decode the message. This method had advantages. It was extremely difficult to crack without knowing which book was being used as the key. It left no obvious pattern that frequency analysis could exploit. But it also had disadvantages. Both sender and receiver needed identical copies of the same text, and creating a message was laborious, requiring lookup of every character. Chinese agents also employed invisible inks, though their formulas differed from Western ones. They discovered that rice water mixed with certain minerals created invisible writing that could be revealed with heat or specific chemical treatments. They used plant extracts that remained invisible until exposed to particular smoke or vapor. The Chinese fascination with alchemy contributed to cryptographic development. Alchemists seeking immortality elixirs experimented with countless substances, noting their properties. Some of these experiments produced compounds useful for secret writing. Knowledge flowed between alchemical laboratories and intelligence operations, each benefiting from the other's discoveries. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, both Roman and Chinese empires had developed mature, sophisticated intelligence capabilities. They employed similar methods, invisible inks, coded messages, double agents, surveillance networks, arrived at independently or through the slow diffusion of ideas along trade routes. But these capabilities couldn't prevent the challenges both empires faced. Rome's 3rd century crisis saw decades of civil war, economic collapse, and barbarian invasions. China's Han dynasty collapsed, fragmenting into competing kingdoms. Intelligence networks that had served unified empires struggled to adapt to fragmented political landscapes. During periods of chaos, espionage became more localized, more personal. Warlords employed spies against rival warlords. Regional governors built their own intelligence networks, no longer reporting to a central authority. The systematic, bureaucratic approach gave way to ad hoc arrangements based on personal loyalty. Yet even in chaos, the need for intelligence didn't diminish. If anything, it intensified. When you don't know who controls the next valley, when alliances shift weekly, when betrayal is common, information becomes more valuable than ever. A spy who could provide warning of an impending attack, who could identify which of your allies was negotiating with your enemies, who could locate food supplies in a devastated landscape. Such a person might determine whether you survived another season. The collapse of empires scattered knowledge and techniques across wider populations. Methods once restricted to imperial intelligence services became available to anyone willing to learn them. Former imperial agents, unemployed by the collapse of central authority, sold their skills to new masters. The craft of espionage democratized, or perhaps more accurately, decentralized. This diffusion of knowledge would shape the medieval world. The Byzantine Empire, Rome's eastern continuation, inherited Roman intelligence methods and refined them further. Islamic caliphates developed their own sophisticated spy networks, incorporating Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge. European kingdoms employed agents and codes, often learning from Islamic and Byzantine examples encountered during the Crusades. But the ancient world's contribution to espionage wasn't just technical methods. It was the recognition that information is power, that knowledge of your enemy's plans can be more valuable than superior numbers, that wars are often won in secret before they're fought in public. The ancient spies who developed invisible inks from berry juice and plant extracts were predecessors of modern cryptographers working with quantum encryption. The Roman agents who recruited double agents in Parthian courts were predecessors of intelligence officers running operations in hostile nations today. The Chinese bureaucrats who systematically collected and analyzed information from across their empire were predecessors of modern intelligence analysts working with satellite imagery and signals intercepts. The techniques have changed, become vastly more sophisticated, enabled by technology ancient peoples couldn't imagine. But the fundamental logic remains the same. Gather information about your adversaries, protect your own secrets, use knowledge to gain advantage. And the moral complexities remain unchanged as well. Consider again the position of an ancient spy. You've betrayed your people, your city, perhaps your family's honor. You've done this for money, or from genuine belief that the foreign power you serve will bring better governance, or because blackmail left you no choice. You've sent information that enabled military victories, that killed soldiers who might have been your neighbors, that led to your city's conquest. Do you sleep easily? Do you rationalize your actions as necessary, as serving a greater good? Or do you lie awake, haunted by what you've done, by the lives altered or ended through your information? The ancient sources don't tell us. They record operations and outcomes, not the inner lives of the operatives. But we can imagine. We must imagine, because these were human beings facing impossible moral choices, living with consequences that likely tormented them. Some ancient spies were undoubtedly opportunists, caring only for their own gain. But others were probably idealists who genuinely believed they were doing right, who thought conquest by a more civilized empire was better than independence under a brutal tyrant. Were they wrong? History rarely provides clear answers to such questions. The same ambiguity surrounds the spy masters, the emperors and generals who directed these operations. They would have justified their intelligence work as necessary statecraft, as protecting their people, as no different from maintaining armies and building walls. And perhaps they were right. Perhaps espionage prevented more wars than it caused, gave advance warning that saved lives, enabled diplomatic solutions by revealing the true balance of power. Or perhaps espionage simply made betrayal systematic, created industries of treachery, corroded trust between people and within societies. Perhaps the surveillance states that emperors built to protect their power actually weakened their realms by destroying the social bonds that hold civilizations together. These questions don't have simple answers. They didn't in ancient times, and they don't now. We live in an age of unprecedented surveillance, where intelligence agencies monitor communications globally, where data on billions of people is collected and analyzed. Are we safer? Are we freer? Would the ancient emperors who built the first surveillance states recognize our world, and what would they think of what we've created? But let us return to ancient times, to the specific human moments that illuminate this hidden history. In Alexandria, around 180 of the Common Era, a scholar named Philo works late in the Great Library. He's translating a Persian mathematical text into Greek, unremarkable work that will earn him a small payment from the library's administration. But Philo is more than a scholar. He's a Roman agent, and the mathematical text contains coded information about Parthian military deployments, disguised within seemingly innocent number problems. Philo decodes carefully, writing his findings on a separate papyrus. When he finishes, he'll seal this intelligence report and give it to a sea captain he knows, who will deliver it to Roman authorities in Antioch. The captain thinks he's carrying a personal letter. He doesn't know his ship is carrying information that might shape the empire's eastern strategy for years to come. Is Philo a hero or a traitor? He's Roman by citizenship, but Greek by culture. He lives in Egypt, works for a library that serves a cosmopolitan scholarly community, sends intelligence about Persians to Romans. His loyalties are complex, layered, probably confused even to himself. What we can say is that he's skilled at his craft. He's learned Persian well enough to decode the hidden message. He's maintained his cover for years. He manages his fear because he must feel fear, knowing that discovery would mean a horrible death. Does he believe in what he's doing? Or does he simply do it because he's trapped, because he said yes once and can't say no now, because the Romans know his secret and could expose him any time? The historical record doesn't tell us. Philo is a fiction, but he represents the reality of countless actual operatives whose names are lost. Meanwhile, in Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, a Roman agent lives under deep cover. Her name is Livia, though she uses a Parthian name now, and has for so many years she sometimes forgets her Roman one. She was recruited 15 years ago when she was barely 20, brought to Parthia as a slave, freed by a Roman operative who then died, leaving her to continue the mission. She married a Parthian merchant. She has children who are Parthian, who speak Parthian as their first language, who worship Persian gods. She loves them. She also sends information to Rome that might one day enable an invasion that would destroy their world. How does she live with this contradiction? Perhaps she tells herself the children are adaptable, that they'd survive Roman conquest, might even prosper under it. Perhaps she doesn't think about it. compartmentalizing her spy work from her family life. Perhaps it's killing her slowly, this double existence. When historians write about ancient espionage, they usually focus on the emperors who ordered operations, the generals who used intelligence, the dramatic coups and assassinations that resulted from spy work. They rarely write about people like Livia, the long-term, deep-cover operatives whose whole lives became the mission, who sacrificed not just safety, but identity, becoming someone else so completely that their original self almost disappeared. These operatives existed. The historical record occasionally reveals them indirectly through references to long-resident agents or naturalized observers. But we know almost nothing about their actual experiences, their psychological states, how they managed the incredible stress of perpetual deception. Modern intelligence agencies recognize this stress. They provide psychological support, rotation schedules, retirement plans. Ancient operatives had none of this. They were expected to maintain their cover until they died or were discovered, and most died without ever being publicly acknowledged for their service. Their sacrifices vanished into history's silence. Yet some found meaning in their work. Some believed genuinely that their intelligence prevented wars, that by giving their emperor accurate information about enemy capabilities, they made peaceful negotiation more likely. When both sides know the truth, the reasoning went, pointless wars over misunderstandings become less likely. This logic isn't entirely wrong. Good intelligence can prevent conflicts born from miscalculation. If a Roman emperor knows exactly how strong Parthian defenses are, he might choose diplomacy over a costly invasion. If a Parthian emperor knows Rome's legions are overstretched, he might negotiate a favorable treaty rather than risking war. But intelligence can also enable aggression. A king who knows his enemy is weak might attack when he would otherwise have left them alone. Information is a tool, morally neutral, its ethical value determined by how it's used. The ancient world understood this ambiguity. The Greek playwright Sophocles, writing 5 centuries before the Common Era, explored the moral complexity of spies in his play, Philoctetes. The character Odysseus, history's archetypal cunning strategist, sends a young man to deceive and manipulate the wounded hero Philoctetes. The young man succeeds but feels corrupted by the deception, questioning whether victory justifies such methods. This ancient drama asks questions that remain relevant. Does the end justify the means? Is it acceptable to lie and manipulate for a good cause? When does cleverness become mere duplicity? When does necessary deception corrupt the deceiver? Ancient philosophers debated these questions. Some, like the Stoics, argued that virtue required absolute honesty, that lies and deception always corrupted the soul regardless of intention. Others took a more pragmatic view, arguing that circumstances sometimes require morally questionable actions, that leaders must sometimes dirty their hands to protect their people. Neither position fully satisfies. The absolutist view seems naive about political reality. Can a state really function without any secrets, any deception? Yet the pragmatic view opens dangerous doors. If we justify small deceptions for good reasons, where do we draw the line? How do we prevent the slow slide into total amorality? Ancient spies and their masters navigated these moral tangles without clear guidance. They made choices, lived with consequences, and mostly disappeared from historical record, their dilemmas unresolved. By the late 2nd century of the Common Era, both Roman and Parthian empires faced increasing challenges. Germanic tribes pressed on Rome's northern borders. Steppe nomads threatened Parthia's eastern frontiers. Internal political instability weakened both empires. The golden age of ancient espionage was ending, though neither empire knew it yet. Intelligence networks that had operated for decades began to fail. Long-term agents aged out without suitable replacements. The training systems that had produced skilled operatives broke down as resources went to more immediate military needs. The careful collection and analysis of information gave way to panicked responses to crises. In Rome, the assassination of the Emperor Commodus in 192 led to civil war. Multiple generals fought for the throne. Each had their own intelligence networks, but these focused on each other rather than on external threats. Roman spycraft turned inward, becoming a tool of civil conflict rather than external security. The eventual victor, Septimius Severus, restored order, but at tremendous cost. The empire had exhausted itself in internal conflict. The sophisticated intelligence apparatus that earlier emperors had built was damaged, its best operatives dead or discredited, its methods exposed through the civil war's chaos. Parthia faced similar problems. Dynastic conflicts weakened central authority. Provincial governors became semi-independent warlords. The intelligence networks that had served the empire fragmented, along with political unity. Yet even in decline, these empires' espionage traditions influenced their successors. When the Sassanid Persians overthrew the Parthians in 224 of the Common Era, they inherited and adapted Parthian intelligence methods. When Germanic tribes eventually established kingdoms on Roman territory, they adopted Roman administrative techniques, including the use of informers and agents. The knowledge didn't disappear. It transformed, adapted, continued through new institutions and cultures. The legacy of ancient espionage extends beyond specific techniques or organizations. It lies in the recognition that information is power, that states require intelligence to function, that the tension between security and freedom is ancient and perhaps permanent. Modern democracies struggle with questions ancient empires answered with brutal simplicity. How much surveillance is acceptable in a free society? When does legitimate intelligence gathering become oppression? How do we hold secret agencies accountable while allowing them to keep necessary secrets? These questions would have puzzled ancient emperors. They didn't conceive of governance in terms of individual rights versus state power. The state's survival was paramount. Individual privacy barely existed as a concept. Yet their experience remains relevant because they faced the same fundamental challenge: how to gather information needed for security without destroying the social trust that makes civilization possible. Ancient Rome's Delata system shows what happens when surveillance becomes too pervasive. Social trust collapsed. People withdrew from public life, afraid to speak freely. Innovation slowed because people feared drawing attention. The empire grew brittle, unable to adapt to changing circumstances because honest feedback couldn't reach decision-makers through the layers of fear and sycophancy. The lesson seems clear. Surveillance states that don't face external accountability eventually consume themselves. They create the very instability they claim to prevent. Yet complete transparency seems equally problematic. States that can't keep secrets, that can't gather intelligence about threats, that expose all their strategic thinking to adversaries. Such states won't survive long in a competitive international system. The balance between security and freedom, between necessary secrets and dangerous opacity, between legitimate intelligence and oppressive surveillance. Ancient empires never found this balance. Neither have we. Perhaps the balance doesn't exist, at least not as a stable equilibrium. Perhaps it's more like walking a tightrope, requiring constant adjustment, never perfectible, always one step from falling to one extreme or another. Ancient spies couldn't have imagined our world of digital surveillance, of computers that monitor millions of communications simultaneously, of satellites that photograph every meter of Earth's surface. The scale of modern intelligence capabilities would have seemed like magic or divine power to them. Yet, they would have recognized the fundamental dynamics. They knew that empires competed for information advantage. They knew that intelligence work required systematic organization, trained operatives, secure communication methods. They knew that the best intelligence comes from human sources who can provide not just facts but context, who can explain motivations and predict behaviors. Our technology has changed. Human nature hasn't. An ancient Roman spy deciding whether to betray a target, weighing moral scruples against mission requirements, faced the same internal conflict as a modern intelligence officer in the same situation. The specifics differ. The ancient spy might be offering gold, the modern one might be offering a new identity and relocation. But the moral calculus is identical. The courage required hasn't changed either. Ancient agents operating deep in enemy territory faced the same fear of discovery, the same loneliness of isolation, the same stress of maintaining cover identities as modern deep cover operatives. Technology provides modern spies with better communication and extraction options, but the fundamental psychological challenges are timeless. The ancient world's most important contribution to espionage might be simply this: proving that systematic intelligence work is possible, that it can be organized and sustained over time, that it provides real strategic advantage despite all its moral ambiguity and practical challenges. Before the ancient empires systematized espionage, intelligence gathering was ad hoc, personal, unreliable. A ruler might send a trusted servant to observe an enemy, but there was no continuity, no institutional knowledge, no training or methodology. Each operation started from scratch. The Persians, Greeks, Romans, and Chinese changed this. They created institutions, developed training programs, established communication protocols, built networks that persisted across generations. They turned espionage from an improvisation into a profession. This institutionalization had costs. It made espionage more effective, but also more impersonal, more prone to becoming an end in itself rather than a means to security. Spy agencies, once established, tend to expand, to find new missions that justify their continued existence and increased budgets. This pattern was visible in ancient Rome and remains visible today. But institutionalization also allowed knowledge to accumulate. The Romans could learn from Greek and Persian methods. The Chinese could develop sophisticated techniques over centuries, each generation building on the previous one's experience. The institutional memory preserved lessons learned, mistakes made, methods that worked, and ones that failed. Some of this knowledge survived the ancient world's collapse. Byzantine intelligence services maintained Roman traditions. Islamic caliphates studied Persian and Byzantine methods. Medieval European kingdoms learned from all these sources. The threads connect across centuries, linking ancient Persian spies to modern intelligence agencies through a long chain of adaptation and innovation. The invisible ink that ancient operatives made from berry juice and plant extracts led eventually to more sophisticated chemical methods, to invisible radio waves, to encrypted digital communications. The courier systems ancient empires built evolved into modern secure communication channels. The double agents ancient empires recruited were predecessors of today's human intelligence operations. Yet for all this continuity, something was lost in the transitions between ancient and modern espionage. The ancient world's spies often had direct relationships with the rulers they served. A Roman frumentarius might report directly to the emperor. A Chinese agent might be personally known to the general employing him. This created accountability, or at least personal connection. Modern intelligence agencies are vast bureaucracies where most operatives never meet the political leaders their work ultimately serves. This distance can be good. It can protect against politicization of intelligence. But it can also create disconnection, where the human cost of intelligence work becomes abstract statistics rather than personal knowledge. Ancient emperors who ordered executions based on spy reports had to live with the results personally. Modern decision-makers often don't see the consequences of their intelligence-based decisions, at least not directly. The distance might make certain decisions easier. Whether that's an improvement is debatable. As we reach the end of our journey through ancient espionage, certain patterns emerge clearly. Intelligence work has always been morally complex, often brutal, sometimes necessary, and never without cost, both to those who practice it and to the societies that employ it. The agents who developed invisible inks and secret codes were innovators, applying chemistry and mathematics to practical problems. But they were innovators in service of deception, their cleverness directed toward hiding truth rather than revealing it. This tension between intelligence and deception, between serving truth and obscuring it, has always characterized spycraft. The double agents who betrayed their homelands were sometimes opportunists, sometimes idealists, sometimes people trapped by circumstances beyond their control. History judges them harshly, calling them traitors. But perhaps some genuinely believed they were serving a higher good. We can't know their hearts, only their actions, and actions without understood motivations can be misinterpreted across millennia. The emperors and generals who built intelligence networks believed they were protecting their people, securing their empires against threats. Some were right. Intelligence prevented conflicts, exposed genuine plots, provided warning of real dangers. Others used their spy networks primarily to suppress dissent and maintain power. Most did both, their motivations mixed, their legacies ambiguous. The ordinary people who lived under these surveillance regimes, who never spied or were spied upon, who simply tried to live quiet lives, they're almost invisible in the historical record. Yet they were the majority. Most ancient people weren't involved in espionage. They farmed, traded, raised families, practiced crafts, worshipped gods, lived and died without ever touching the shadow world of intelligence operations. But they were affected by it. The taxes they paid funded spy networks. The wars intelligence enabled or prevented shaped their lives. The climate of fear that surveillance created might have silenced them, might have prevented them from speaking truth or organizing for change or simply living freely. This is perhaps espionage's greatest cost. Not what it does to the spies themselves, not even what it does to the spied-upon targets, but what it does to everyone else. The knowledge that someone might be watching, that words might be reported, that trust might be betrayed. This knowledge changes how people live, makes them smaller, more cautious, less fully human. Ancient empires paid this price, and so do we. The question has always been whether the security gained justifies the freedom and trust lost. Each generation must answer this question for itself. The ancient world's answer varied by empire and era, but generally favored security over freedom. We've attempted a different balance, with mixed results. The story of ancient espionage is ultimately a human story. It's about people making difficult choices under pressure, about the constant tension between competing values, about the unintended consequences that follow when we prioritize security above all else or naively ignore genuine threats. The invisible inks have faded. The secret messages have been read or lost. The spies have died, their names mostly forgotten. The empires they served have collapsed, their power scattered to history's winds. What remains is the legacy of their choices, the institutions and methods they created, the moral questions they raised but couldn't answer. These questions persist because they're rooted in permanent tensions of human social existence, the need for security versus the desire for freedom, the value of truth versus the practical requirement for secrets, the rights of individuals versus the survival of communities. Ancient spies can't answer these questions for us, but they can remind us that the questions are old, that every generation has struggled with them, that easy answers should be distrusted because generations of thoughtful people have failed to find them. Perhaps this is enough, not answers, but awareness. Awareness that surveillance has costs even when justified. That betrayal corrupts the betrayer even when serving good ends. That security purchased through pervasive fear is a false security, brittle and ultimately self-defeating. The ancient world teaches these lessons not through explicit moral instruction, but through the long record of consequences. We can observe what happened when Roman emperors expanded surveillance too far, when Chinese dynasties relied too heavily on informers, when paranoid rulers saw conspiracies everywhere and thus created them. We can also observe what happened when empires neglected intelligence, when rulers remained ignorant of genuine threats, when idealism prevented necessary pragmatism. The lesson isn't that one extreme is right and the other wrong. The lesson is that extremes are dangerous, that wisdom requires balance, and that balance requires constant vigilance and adjustment. As our journey through ancient espionage concludes, imagine one final scene. The sun sets over the Mediterranean. In a small coastal village, an old man sits outside his modest home, watching the fishing boats return. He's retired now, living on a small pension from a long career as a merchant. His neighbors know him as honest, quiet, generous with children, and kind to animals. They don't know that for 30 years he was a Roman agent operating in Parthian territory. They don't know how many reports he sent, how many people his information may have killed or saved, whether his work prevented wars or enabled them. The old man himself isn't certain anymore. The missions blur together. The justifications, he told himself, seem hollow now, though no more hollow than the criticisms he imagines others might make. He did what he thought was necessary. He did what he was ordered to do. He survived when many didn't. Now he sits in the evening sun, listening to the waves, watching the boats, remembering fragments of a life lived in shadows while pretending to be someone else. Is he at peace? Perhaps. Or perhaps some betrayals can never be fully reconciled. Some secrets can never be entirely shared. Some parts of ourselves can never be wholly recovered once we've traded them for empire's coin. The stars emerge one by one, filling the darkening sky. The same stars that guided ancient caravans carrying secret messages. The same stars that looked down on Persian kings, reading coded dispatches. The same stars that illuminated Roman agents writing in invisible ink by lamplight. The stars witness everything and judge nothing. They saw the rise of empires and their fall. The clever schemes and the desperate gambles, the betrayals and the loyalties, the cruelties and the kindnesses that happened in their light. And they'll outlast us all, our intelligence agencies and our secrets, our justified paranoia and our necessary deceptions, our security and our freedom, our fears and our hopes. The night deepens. The old man goes inside, closing the door gently. Somewhere, in another city, another agent begins their shift, maintaining watch, gathering intelligence, protecting secrets. The work continues, as it always has, as perhaps it always will. But for now, in this moment, there is only peace. The quiet village sleeps. The sea whispers against the shore. The stars wheel slowly in their ancient patterns, marking time that makes empires brief and human concerns fleeting. All the secret messages have been delivered or lost. All the invisible ink has faded or been revealed. All the ancient spies have spoken their last coded words and taken their final secrets to the grave. What remains is the sea, the stars, the turning of the earth. What remains is the question of how we live, what we value, what we're willing to sacrifice for security, and what we must preserve despite the risks. The ancient world cannot answer these questions for us, but it can remind us to ask them thoughtfully, carefully, with full awareness of what's at stake. And then it can invite us to rest, to set aside the weight of unanswerable questions, to simply be present in this moment, under these stars, in this brief and precious existence. The night is deep. The world is quiet. Sleep comes gently, as it has for millennia, bringing peace to the troubled and rest to the weary, erasing for a time the boundaries between ancient and modern, between secret and revealed, between the shadows we cast and the light we seek. Rest now. The stories have been told. The secrets have been shared. The long journey through invisible inks and coded messages, through double agents and imperial intrigues, has reached its end. Tomorrow brings new questions, new challenges, new choices between security and freedom, between necessary secrets and dangerous deceptions. But tomorrow can wait. Tonight, there is only peace. Only stars, only the gentle boundary between waking and sleep, between knowing and letting go. The ancient world recedes into darkness, its spies silent at last, its empires return to dust, its secret messages waiting in archives for scholars who may or may not ever read them. And we, standing at the border between their time and ours, can finally release the weight of history, can finally let the questions rest, can finally close our eyes and drift away into the peace that awaits beyond all knowing, all scheming, all the games of empire and shadow. Sleep well.